And the first two lines are just for those of us who kind of maybe figure where he's already. He's reiterating our reliance on the Buddha and his teachings. They call it refuge. And then it says, you know, it says, I go to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Okay. The second two lines are stating now, I always like to say this, the Tibetans always say that you set your motivation. What's your motivation for doing something? This is a crucial point, actually. And I think we might use that term ourselves. We might say, what's our purpose? Why are you doing it? And why are we here together, listening to these teachings? Well, you know, we can decide. Why not make it something altruistic, something big? And we're going to listen to these teachings, think about the meaning, see if there's any tools we can apply in our daily life, sort of advice, so that on the one hand, we can develop our own amazing potential, so we can help others, because we're all in the same boat. Thinking like that. You can sing it in Tibetan a couple of times. That's the first recitation in English. Now we do two more in Tibetan. Okay. Sangye tarang soke tognam la, jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi, dagi chönyen gi personam ki, drola penche sangye dropa shog, sangye tarang soke tognam la, jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi, dagi chönyen gi personam ki, drola penche sangye dropa shog, sangye tarang soke tognam la, jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi, dagi chönyen gi personam ki, drola penche sangye dropa shog. Actually, it would have been auspicious to offer a mandala. You don't do that, Venerable Dondra? Really? Okay. But I think for this is special because it's this kind of special. My teaching is not special, but the topic is pretty incredible. Lama Yeshe. So maybe it's nice we just do one as well. Is that okay? Yeah. So let's put the mandala on. Mary. Should have come first, but never mind. So this is kind of, it's making an offering as a request for the teachings. That's the meaning. So of course it's this mandala offering. So we visualize all the marvelous things of the world that make people happy, really. That's the contents of the universe, a mandala. This is our abode, you know. The mandala is the abode of the Buddha, and this is our mandala, this world. So we offer it as a request for the teaching. Think like this, you know. Saji Paki Jugshing Metog Tramri Rablingji Ni De Genpadi Sangye Jingdu Mikche Urwagi Drokon Namdag Jing La Chepasho Idam Guru Rachna Mandala Kam Niyatayami. Okay. Yeah, so this topic, this is based on a book by Lama Yeshe. It's a teaching he gave in Australia in 1982 or something, based on a text by one of the Gelugpa lineage lamas, Panchen Lama, in the 17th century. And typically, when it's given as a teaching, and this is how Lama Yeshe gave it in Australia, it's preceded by actually a highest yoga tantra initiation. Well, clearly that's not going to happen here. I'm not qualified to do that. But so I just sort of feel it's like Lama's book, and I'm making a few points about it because it's really Lama Yeshe's teaching. So I'll just say a few things so it can help us understand a little bit what's in the book. The best way to think about it, you know. So I'm not doing it in the most formal, proper way. So basically, it's a particular type of meditation on emptiness. That's what it is. How to realize the emptiness of your own mind. So I think because my feeling, because Lama Yeshe, when he'd been teaching Westerners by that point for about 6 years, I suppose, maybe when he first met Westerners 10 years before that, 82, 72, no, more than that. He first met Western students, or non-Tibetan students, you know. he and Lama Zopa were together in Darjeeling. They were there because Lama Yeshe escaped from Lhasa and ended up in this place in 1959, this place in the north of India, where all the lamas and the monks were sent. And then Lama Zopa, he's a Sherpa, but he'd been in Tibet, just across the border, and then when all the business happened. And so he then escaped first to Bhutan and then ended up in the same place. He's 10 years younger than Lama Yeshe. Lama Yeshe was 25 at the time. And Lama Zopa was eventually introduced to Lama when he was about 17 or 18, I think. And he stayed with him until Lama Yeshe passed away in 1984. He was his main disciple. So when they were in Darjeeling one year, 67 or something, because of Lamas, a lot of the Tibetans coming from those high places came down to this, intense tropical, intensely different, not so much tropical, but hot, a shocking environment for the Tibetans. I mean, they all would drop like flies. They were dying continuously from TB. Even now, this is very common. So Lama Zopa got TB a couple of times. He's quite sick. So Lama Yeshe took him up to Darjeeling, where it's more cool. And there they met this American, well, actually not American, I think she'd become an American. Her name was Zina Ratevsky. Lama Yeshe liked to call her a Russian princess. She wasn't Russian, she wasn't a princess. She's maybe like a Ukrainian aristocrat or something, but Lama just like Russian princess, So Zina, the Russian princess. And it was very funny in New York, where I'm living now, in the West Village in Manhattan. And in the building I lived, there was mail for me from somebody, and it was Venerable Robina. And this woman upstairs who lives in the apartment above me, she said, "Oh, I know a very famous Venerable." She said she had been married, get this right, she'd been married to Zina Ratevsky's husband's son. So that's very funny. I met this woman there, Venerable. Anyway, so she was like Lama Zopa, she's first student. And then from there, they went to Kathmandu. And that was coinciding right at that time with an influx of Western hippies coming for two things, marijuana and enlightenment. And for some bizarre reason, Western hippies somehow equate them. And the only reason I can think is because when you see Tibetans, very traditional Tibetans, well, you can't tell a girl from a boy because the men have long hair. They wear these big coral earrings and they have their hair wrapped up in a cloth, a kind of string around it, and they wear dresses. So you really can't tell the difference. It's very fascinating. So that looks like a hippie to us. So we thought they were but actually they're really conservative people, not just how they dressed, So there's always this concept that somehow Buddhism and enlightenment were related to marijuana. It's a very odd, absurd connection, really. So Lama Yeshe, and for me, this is what's interesting. I think it really shows the way that Lama Yeshe, was capable in the most astonishing way. He's kind of famous for this. He learned English. Both of them. They must have kind of had an intimation of many of their first students would be English speakers because they just started learning English. In fact, Lama Zopa would laugh and talk when he's a little boy, when he first in Baxador, from the time he was. Even before that, actually, but when he was about 15, 10, what was he? It was 1959, and he was born in whatever, he must have been 49, 15, 12 or 14 or 15 or something like that. And he started to learn English. He thought he just should learn English. So he started, typically the way that Tibetans learn things is they memorize. So he started memorizing the dictionary. And then he started finding Time magazine. So he started trying to memorize Time magazine, I don't think it lasted very long in his effort to learn English, right? It was very sweet. But they both started learning English. And the thing that always blows my mind, I happen to have the job of editing Lama Yeshe's teachings, both of them actually. And what's astonishing, I never get over it. Lama has this astonishing ability. His English was chaotic, right? He had no pride about whether it sounded good or not. But he had this extraordinary ability to choose to speak in a way that was incredibly modern. And I can't stress this interesting point enough. I mean, the Tibetans had been in isolation, basically, in their country. Nobody went over those mountains,
I mean, a few Christians tried. I think that the Jesuits went there in the Middle Ages and even translated the Bible into Tibetan. They couldn't get one Tibetan, you know. I read recently too about another Catholic priest who spent years in Tibet. He learned Tibetan. He learned how to debate in his determination to try and convert Tibetans. They weren't interested, you know. So they were really kind of isolated in there. There was a few Muslims there, a few Muslims in Lhasa, apparently. They kind of just, you know, they all did their own thing. But the Tibetans, first of all, their language, when they learn Dharma, it's a completely unique language just for Dharma, for the philosophy. They've got regular language, they've got extremely sophisticated honorific language, which they still use. And then they've got their philosophical language. It's extraordinary, actually. I don't speak it. And when you know, if you read like texts by some of the Tibetan scholars, let's say from Tsongkhapa in the 14th century, that's exactly how they talked. Right now in the 21st century, 20th century. The Lama Zopa, even he's famous for talking like that. The way they structure, the way their language is formed, the way they structure their thoughts. It's really, really arcane, you know. So for Lama Yeshe to come along and talk just like a hippie, it was really quite astonishing, so skillful, actually. You know, he just had this ability to communicate in a way that I always joke and say he was really a hippie, but he just pretended to be Tibetan or something, you know, because it's so remarkable. He had this extraordinary ability with his crazy, chaotic English to communicate, and because some other concepts. And because I edited this book, Mahamudra, and I say it in the preface, that the terms he used, you know, for example, the word in Tibetan that's typical in the literature that's coming from the Sanskrit, the one main word they ever use referring to the neurotic states of mind. I mean, that's the word I use, neurotic states of mind. I mean, Buddha would have liked that. For anger and attachment and jealousy, all the rubbish parts of our mind, which is the crucial way you have to understand the Buddha's view of the mind. Well, affliction is the typical word they use, affliction. And sometimes, you know, they'd say mental affliction, which is exactly the point, because we know an affliction can be, you know, pain in the knee or a kind of problem in your life, you know. We know we don't use that term. We know it's very arcane. We just don't use it in daily life. I don't think so. So Lama Yeshe just somehow knew that. I don't know how. He never used it. He never used that term, ever. And I identified about 21 different terms that he basically made up in his crazy way to try and convey to us the meaning of that concept, you know, like dualistic puzzle. I mean, dualistic puzzle, you know, can you imagine? All these extraordinary terms he'd use in his effort to communicate. I'm still moved by it. Whenever it blows my mind, you know. So because by that point, 82, when Lama was teaching this, he'd been teaching Westerners since about, he met Zena in 67, 68, then went to Kathmandu, then met all these hippies, and then they finally moved up to Courtin Monastery on a hill, you know, kind of northeast of Kathmandu, about 40-minute walk, on a hill called Courtin, like a little village there. And this is where now Courtin Monastery is, a place of 600 monks and 600 nuns down the road, really fully developed monastic environment, you know. And he started teaching there. Their first course for Westerners was in 1971 there, you know. So since 71, teaching in earnest and then having courses, and before a couple of years time, a couple hundred people would come for these courses every year. So really an interest in among Western people. And I mean, it's not just now, it's also people in China, people in Hong Kong, people in Singapore. But first then it was mainly Westerners, so-called Westerners, Europeans, Americans, Australians, you know. So by that point, 82, I think Lama gave the Haruka Chakra Sambhara, highest Yoga Tantra initiation. And it was the first one he'd given in Australia. I think at that point, I don't think he's given any perhaps he'd given other countries, I'm not sure. So most of the Western students then, I wasn't there then. I'd met him already, but I wasn't there. I'm from Australia. He taught it at a centre about 2 hours north of Melbourne, where I'm from, a Tisha Centre. We didn't have much philosophical background. Nobody really learned much about the highest teachings. Nobody really was doing any philosophical study. So Lama taught in a very kind of casual way, very down-to-earth way, very traditional, correct, doing the initiation first, giving all the preliminary practices first, like he said I should, you know, he did. But he taught it in a very easy way. And because emptiness is a difficult topic for people, no matter how much you studied, it's the most intense. It's kind of the end result of all the study, you know, culminates in this understanding of emptiness. So here, for example, so the key thing about Mahamudra, this technique, which was a secret technique, kept secret, and it was passed down from disciple, student, you know, Lama to disciple. Then Panchen Lama wrote his text, and it was the first time it became public, if you like, you know. Lama used that text by Panchen Lama, which is in the book of Mahamudra, that's available from Wisdom, which I recommend you buy. It's in there, the text is there, it's very sweet. Maybe this weekend we'll just read it for the blessing of receiving the blessing of Panchen Lama's words, you know. So, you know, emptiness, as we've heard in his teachings at all, is the shorthand for the way that things exist ultimately. And everything leads to that. Everything leads to that. Your mind is kind of primed to get to that point, you know. And so, of course, the one we have to learn to understand the emptiness of, I quoted His Holiness in the preface, and so let me find the book. I'll read it to you. I should have brought my iPad. Get my iPad. So I'll do that in a minute. So basically, you know, we've got to realize the emptiness of everything. Typically in the teachings, they talk about the emptiness of self and the emptiness of phenomena. The emptiness of self and the emptiness of phenomena. We have to get the realization of both of those. But you start by getting the realization of the self. And then on the basis of this, you can then realize the emptiness of basically everything else. That's what it means by phenomena, everything else. This is a really typical way they teach. So at the beginning, when we first start hearing these teachings, the actual Mahamudra is about the emptiness of the mind, which is a phenomenon. It's not the self. But because we're not very real, we don't understand that. When we think of I, we think of our mind. So we almost think that it's synonymous. So Lama always just would mix this. He didn't make it too complicated for us. He'd always talk about the emptiness of self, the emptiness of consciousness, as if it were the same thing. But in reality, it's not. But we wouldn't have understood that. So he kept it always very simple how he taught. Lama was just, I can't get over how extraordinary he was, you know. And he's renowned for that, in his ability to bring it on the earth, to keep it simple. And it's only really a yogi and a scholar who could do that. You know, if you speak simply and you understand something, it's only because you understand it can you put it simply, you know, otherwise it's all intellectual. So the big point about Mahamudra is it's Lama talks about it and Panchen Lama talks. There's two ways as Panchen Lama talks in the text, there's two ways we learn to realize, there's two methods for realizing emptiness, you know. It's in a minute. I'll read to you in a second. Find the book first. Okay. So, as Panchen Lama says, there's two ways. Let me find it. I like to quote Lama all the time. There's two methods. There's two methods for realizing emptiness. One is the fact is, this is the typical way we learn everything. You start with the theories, don't you? If you want to become a musician, you don't go straight to the piano and put your hands there and kind of hope music comes out. No, you've got to squeeze your brain with really complex musical theory. We know that, you know. You don't just intuit numbers. You learn the theories. You learn the recipe before you make the cake. It's a really traditional, typical way of studying, of learning anything. We understand it intimately and we're brilliant at it. Anything we accomplish, any skill, it starts like that. And then as you keep doing it, then your knowledge becomes more intuitive, doesn't it? It becomes more natural because it's now internalized. We understand that. Now, the Mahamudra approach, the other approach, as Panchen Lama says, you know, is that you do the exact opposite. You go straight to the piano, and I'm using that as the analogy, and you intuit Bach. Now, obviously, that's pretty advanced, isn't it? And it, in a way, immediately implies that if you can go straight to the piano and have a direct experience of music, not going through the method of theory, that implies you've already got the theory in your mind. It implies it. Who could, I mean, I was amazed when I look on YouTube and see these little children playing Bach, you know. There's one I haven't watched for a while. He must be 10 by now, but I've been watching him since he's like 6. This little Russian boy. It's a total insane genius, you know. You can't believe your ears. In other words, he's doing Mahamudra. He's going straight to the piano, and Mark comes out. So, but the point, I find an interesting point. Anybody who can go straight and intuit cooking and intuit anything is because you practiced it before. And of course, that fits perfectly with the Buddhist view of karma, you know. That includes killing and stealing, isn't it? I mean, anger. I had experience of anger. My mother didn't have to teach me. I had got Mahamudra of anger. I knew how to do it immediately. I didn't have to learn the theory. First think an angry thought, get your fist up, shout loud. I knew how to do it. I'm not being kidding. I'm not kidding here. I'm talking about any habits. And that happens to fit with the Buddha's teachings about karma, you know, but you've practiced it before. And so the point of this then is because the whole point of the Mahamudra approach to realizing emptiness is not going via the intellect. The methodology is to help get a taste, get a direct experience, a taste of emptiness. And the whole method is set up to enable us to do that, you know. So of course, if most of us aren't advanced, it doesn't mean you can't try. I know when I started listening to these teachings, I didn't know what they're talking about, realize emptiness. And what it meant, my mind, my eye, who cares, who knows, you know, I haven't got a clue. Lama would get us to do the simple first level of Mahamudra was just observe your mind. I don't know what he meant, observe my mind. We're talking about my mind. So it takes time. So, okay, Mahamudra is this meditation technique for realizing emptiness, basically. That's what it is. So let's see what Lama says. And of course, it's starting off with the realization of the emptiness of yourself or your I, and then that leads to realizing the emptiness of your mind, which is an example of a phenomenon that isn't the mind, that isn't the I. There's the I, and then everything else. And the mind is an example of everything else. So Mahamudra is particularly the emptiness of the mind. So I'll quote it in the preface from His Holiness. Because there's this marvelous book that's quoted here, I use, the Gelug Kagyu tradition of Mahamudra, that Alex Berzin, this American scholar, edited and put together. And it's based on an extensive teaching that, in fact, His Holiness gave on this very text in Dharamsala soon after this event. And Lama Yeshe was the sponsor of that teaching and requested His Holiness to teach it. I was at that event. So I just read from here. So the instructions from this 2-week retreat form the bulk of this book, supplemented with advice Lama gave at retreats hosted by 2 of his own FPMT centers, Vajrapani Institute in California and another one in Holland. So 9 months after the Atisha Center event in March 82, Lama also gave advice in India. Okay, just different things Lama gave from the book. So organized by Lama Yeshe, right, especially for his Western students, hundreds attended. This is the sense. Okay. Lama also gave advice in India during the first Enlightened Experience celebration. He called it that. A marvelous festival of teachings, empowerments, and retreats spanning 6 months. I attended that. Organized by Lama Yeshe, especially for his Western students, and he didn't have many Asian students at that point, mostly Western. Hundreds attended. Many of the teachings and empowerments were given by his own gurus, including His Holiness Dalai Lama. So he requested His Holiness to give a commentary on the same text, on the Panchen Lama text. And then this has since been edited by Alexander Berzin, who translated for His Holiness at the event and incorporated with other teachings published as the Gelug Kagyu tradition of Mahamudra. So at the retreat, Lama Yeshe explained that Mahamudra is a name given to this is Lama's terms, universal reality of emptiness, of non-duality. Lama says, in the inborn nature of all phenomena. And that word phenomenon is a really massively important word in Buddhism. When you first study the Buddhist philosophical kind of approach, you learn the various terms that refer to that which exists. And why you want to learn those terms is because Buddha's entire deal is that we need to learn to cognize the nature of everything that exists and existed It's a massively important word. The phenomenon is one of those. Everything that exists is a phenomenon, an object of knowledge, an existent, an established base. There are many synonyms, you know. So the inborn nature of all phenomena, it exists equally in all things, organic, non-organic, permanent, impermanent, including all beings. Perhaps you're thinking that if Mahamudra is about emptiness, then you've heard it many times before. Well, you're right, the teachings are not so different. But the unique approach of this presentation is the emphasis on meditation, the experience of emptiness, rather than explaining what it means, you know. So instead of the theory about Bach, you go straight to the piano. So it indicates it's already advanced. I mean, imagine doing that, you know, that's pretty incredible. Doesn't mean we can't try. So in Mahamudra meditation, Lama says, the object of concentration is our own mind. We'll go into all this. And so now I'm quoting from His Holiness from his teachings in that same book. So he says in his commentary, yeah, okay. So the Mahamudra uses the two modes of meditation that Buddhism describes. Two, there's only two. One is called literally concentration, Samadi. It's invented by these genius Indians well before the Buddha. And the technique is known as we know, calm abiding. It's described in terms of 9 stages of cultivation and culminates in this state of samadhi, super subtle, profoundly focused, single-pointed concentration. I mean, the likes of which do not exist in our culture, do not exist in neuroscience or psychology. So the best you can do is, you know, imagine it. And of course, it's a level of mind that we don't even posit in our culture. And this is the massive difference, you know. We can all say the word mind. The Buddha's view of what it is and how it functions is so radically different. You know, it's kind of, this is where it sounds kind of like mystical to us, you know. Because one, the Buddha's point is mind is not physical, it's not the brain, it's not even a function of the brain. And at the grosser level of our mind, of course, it exists in dependence upon the brain, but the very grossest level, sensory, and the gross level of conceptuality. That's all we posit, isn't it? But we have these much subtler levels of cognition. And these Indians discovered it with this brilliant technique that they created, you know, this ability to have this subtle concentration that enables you to go beyond the conceptual, beyond the sensory, to a much subtler level of cognition. And that alone is an astonishing thing to accomplish. And you can't get that by just meditating every morning at home. You've got to give up sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and mortgages and dogs, and go to the mountains, to a very isolated, precise environment, and practice day and night for several years, and you'll get single point of concentration. That's just a start. That's the first mode of meditation. So for that type of meditation, you need an object to focus on. So the typical one we always start with, Lord Buddha taught it, is you use your breath. Just start a simple example of something that occurs that's easy to anchor your mind to, the breath. That's just the beginning, because it's an external event. It needs eventually, meditation has to, if your mind can go to subtle levels, beyond conceptuality and beyond the sensory, then necessarily you can't just stick to a physical object like the breath. Eventually the mind has to go to these more subtle levels. So the object of your concentration has to be mental, not physical. But you start, and that's a typical one, but here the object of concentration is your mind itself. And that means whatever arises in your mind, your concepts, because we live at the level of concepts, don't we? You start with that. Eventually, the object of concentration becomes what they call the conventional nature of your mind, which is its non-physicality, its clarity. They talk like that. Well, you start where you are. So, you know, you sit down to focus. You focus. That's the first step. You focus on the thoughts, whatever arises. No discussion. No caught up in any stories. You simply observe the mind. And that's the first mode of meditation, the first step in the Mahamudra meditation. And the second one, typically in Buddhism, we all know, the second mode of meditation is called insight meditation. The first is called shamatha, calm abiding, the name of the technique and the name of the end result. And the second one is called insight or vipassana. So of course we know in the world that there's a type of, teachings that we are called vipassana. People study vipassana, do vipassana meditation, they say. And that's, in fact, just one type of meditation that Lord Buddha taught. There are many insight techniques he taught. And in one that's typical, that's common, that people know about, is the object of meditation is the sensations in your body. I've never done it. And the thing that Buddha wants us to get insight into is impermanence. So it's a very simple technique that Lord Buddha started us off with to get insight into impermanence. But eventually we need insight into everything. If you're studying Buddhism, you want insight into karma, insight into renunciation, insight into your mind, insight into bodhicitta, the insight into all of these. Insight in English, that's what's interesting. In other cultures, it's kind of a bit of a weird word, but in English, it's a really excellent word. Insight, inner seeing. It's a lovely term. We understand it. You say, I just got some insight into my problem. I understand now. It's like when the knowledge goes from your head to your heart. That's the exact meaning of the word insight. So here, in traditional approach that Lama talks about, the first methodology for realizing emptiness is you first study, and he said that's what we did in the monasteries. We studied intensively for years, all the theories, all the philosophy, all the psychology, all the metaphysics, all the epistemology, and then it ends up in the main thing. It leads to your then 3 or 4 years of study of Madhyamika, the teachings on the middle way, the teachings on emptiness. And then as a result of all this, you're meditating on it every day. You must meditate on it every day. But eventually, the typical one that you achieve your Geshe degree, then you go off to the mountains and get some realizations in meditation. That's the typical way. He said that's how he studied everything. But this way is using it's meditation in its nature. No study, no theory. As Lama says, no dogma, no good, no bad, no this, no that. So, of course, we love that way of talking. People often, there's another type of meditation that is taught in other Tibetan traditions. It's similar to Mahamudra, Dzogchen. People get very excited because there's no theory. You don't need to study. I'd much rather do Dzogchen. I'd much rather do Mahamudra. I don't have to study. But that's the interesting point. If you've already got the realization, already got so familiar with all the teachings, and you can go straight to the piano and intuit Bach, then it's true. You don't need to do anything else. But most of us, we don't have, so we have to practice, And indeed, listen to the teachings. And then try the Mahamudra. So the first one is the object of concentration, and we're going to go into this, is the mind itself, the thoughts. So, but the first realization, as I said, and Lama often taught it like this, was the emptiness of yourself, the emptiness of the I. And then that would lead you to the next one, which is the emptiness of your mind. But Lama focused mostly on the emptiness of the I. Because most of us at that point wouldn't have been capable of distinguishing. Sounds confusing to us, I, mind, surely that's the same thing. So anyway, His Holiness just points out this approach. So once we've gained conviction in the lack of true and inherent identity, which is emptiness, on the basis of our own self, that's your first step, we turn to other phenomena. As part of this process, we now take mind as the basis for emptiness. In other words, as the basis that is empty of existing in any fantasized and impossible way. We scrutinize and analyze mind with a correct view to gain a decisive understanding of its empty nature. That's how he talks, okay? Yeah, Lama's creativity, I was just saying in here. For example, he uses 21 different terms for affliction. I'll just read you some. The main term used in Buddhist psychology, which Lama never used. He just knew it was an arcane term. It's so amazing. To refer to states of mind, such as attachment, anger, and the primordial clinging to an I. So some of the terms are variations of accepted synonyms, but most are his own creation. Artificial concept, confused thoughts, contradictory concept, delusion, that's a very typical term. Deluded thought, dualistic concept, dualistic puzzle, dualistic thought, fanatical thinking, hallucination, hallucinated projection, hallucinated vision, impure concept, limited concept, misconception, mistaken concept, negative mental energy, projection, superstition, wrong conception, all variations of and all different ways of putting what an affliction is. Something, but you read those terms, you get the idea. You know, afflictions are pretty horrible. And they're called anger, attachment, jealousy, low self-esteem, anxiety, panic, fear. We know them. They're all of those. It's very interesting, Lama. He's outrageous. So, okay. So Mahamudra, Lama tells us, is a Sanskrit term, and it means great, Maha, seal, seal. So the way they talk about it is somehow that they say emptiness is what seals things as existing. It's just the nature of things. So this, of course, is such a weird concept to us. We have to really get our heads around it. Let's talk about that. Basically what Buddhists, okay. So if somebody keeps telling you about emptiness and says things are empty, things have no inherent nature, or anything for that matter, you'd have to ask, well, why are they telling me? Why are they telling me? Why would Buddha keep saying things are impermanent? We all know one of the first teachings in Buddhism is Buddha tells us about impermanence. So why does he keep telling us things are impermanent? Well, it's fairly evident. It's because we think they're not. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? If someone keeps pointing out that that's yellow, the only reason is because you don't think it's yellow. You don't realize it's yellow. You're making a mistake. And that's the entire point that Buddha's making. All his presentation of all his teachings are all his presentation of how things actually exist. And he's telling us that we're living in la-la land and we don't realize this is how things are. Clearly, if we realize it, why would he waste his time? If I know you know that's yellow, why would I tell you it's yellow? How stupid of me. So I keep saying to you it's yellow. I'll give you all the logical reasons why it's yellow. It's only because you don't realize it's yellow. And that's the point for the Buddha. Thank you. I'll drink some tea. Water. Thank you, my hand. Knocked it on. So, for example, starting point, Buddha tells us that karma is the natural law that runs the universe. Well, I mean, who would have heard that before? Nobody. You know, we thought God ran it. Or we thought, you know, the other one, the materialist, you've got these different views, isn't it? So I can see you better. So Buddha's telling us that's his observation of how things exist. And then he tells us about impermanence. There's extensive teachings in Buddhism about impermanence. Gross impermanence, subtle impermanence. Because that's how reality is, but we don't realize it. So there's a disconnect between the way we see the world and how the world is. And this is the interesting point in Buddhism as far as he's concerned. Why he's pointing these things out, not just to fill our heads with clever knowledge, but because he says, you know what, folks? The extent to which you believe things aren't cause and effect, the extent to which you don't realize things are impermanent, the extent to which you think you're a separate person, the extent to which you think is this and this, is the extent to which you suffer. That's his point, you know. So he tells us things have no inherent nature. Then you think, well, do I think that things have an inherent nature? Who would have ever thought we think we have inherent nature? Who's ever thought of that? Nobody. We think, what is he talking about? Maybe impermanence we understand. We can see we grasp at things as not changing. We can see we don't like things changing. We can get that one. That one we can get. But this one, things have no inherent nature. What is the man saying? And that's what he's saying. In fact, yes, because we grasp so primordially, so totally, so completely, so utterly in the depth of our being to the idea, but so subtle, it's a joke to call it an idea, that everything, I and everything else have an intrinsic, concrete, set in stone character. So that's something we have never thought of. So it's like extra trouble hearing how things in reality exist, telling us how they don't exist, and we don't even realize we don't think that. So it's obvious. If we hear that things have no inherent nature, and he's telling us that that's what we think they have, well, we've got to first establish even what that means. We've got to begin to identify the mistake. It's fairly easy, again, like I said, if we hear about impermanence. We can see from our experience, we grasp at things as unchanging. We can't bear to think of change and death and things. That's evident. But this one, really difficult. So the first step we have to do, if we're studying it in the traditional way, is learn what it even means, how something would be if it were inherent. How would my I be if it did have an intrinsic nature, if it were inherent, if it did exist from its own side, if it does have an inherent character. So, and that's the puzzle for us to even get our heads around that, Because if we can't identify the mistake, you'll never see the truth. And that's a really good example of this. They talk about when you do the typical teachings, the typical way of meditating on emptiness, the first thing you have to establish, because Buddha says we have to, this is the typical way of teaching it, not the Mahamudra style. But this is important. The first, if he's telling us there isn't an inherent I, Robina, then the main thing to establish is what your I would be like if it were inherent. When you can recognize that, then you can easily recognize how it's not that. So you have to first recognize the mistake. And they call that the object to be negated. That's the toughest part. As Lama says, once you've established clearly, and that's exactly what you're trying to do in the second mode of meditation in Mahamudra, is catch. Once you've done your first concentration technique, you've got steadied your mind a little bit. The second mode of it, the insight part, you stay meditating, you stay focused on the mind. You never vary from that, but you kind of have this tiny part of your mind, like a subtle wisdom, like a little, Pancha Lama says, like a little fish moving in water without disturbing it. And that's like a little subtle wisdom, like you're looking at the corner of your eye to try to catch, experientially, try to catch how the I feels. This is the method. It's very subtle, very, very subtle, It's very fascinating. So the general idea is we have to establish, because, okay, if things are impermanent, then we have to establish how we think they're not. That's really obvious. If things are the result of cause and effect, which is what Buddha says, that's a big shock to us, because meaning cause and effect of my own mind, that things happen to me that I caused in a past life, that's a big shock to us, that we do not agree with that. We think everybody else is the cause of my suffering. Buddha says, I'm the cause. I've done actions in the past that set me up to have these experiences of suffering. And I did actions in my past that set me up to have happy experiences too, that I'm the creator of my own reality. That is definitely not something we think. But in order to understand karma, we've got to learn to check how that's how we think. We know we think this way. I didn't ask to get born, did I? It's not my fault, is it? That's exactly how we think. But here the opposite is quite shocking. To see how we grasp at I, grasp at mine, grasp at my possessions. We can see how we think the opposite of impermanent. But this one, emptiness, is much more subtle. How there's no, Buddha's saying in the depth of our being, we believe utterly and completely and implicitly and totally without question, but beyond evident thought, but utterly programmed in our mind. There is in here somewhere, along with my ears and my nose and my eyes and my pee-pee and my caca and my knees and my toes, a part of me, a piece, as my friend Pende says, walking hand in hand with all the other pieces that make me up. And that piece is called I. Buddha says, sorry, guys. First of all, there isn't one. And anyway, honey child, you don't need one. These ridiculous words. We laugh when we hear that, But this is coming from Buddha's observation. And the realization of this one, that's the cause of liberation. When you've done that, when you've perfected that realization, when you've seen the truth of that and then perfected it, you achieve what's called your nirvana, your liberation from suffering and its causes. You become free of the dramas, This is what he's saying. 10 to 8. Any questions, people? We're going to try and unpack all this in the weekend, okay? Any questions? Any questions from anybody on what I've said so far? Good, tell me. Where's that? Yes, sweetheart, go. Uh-huh. Keep to the side of it. Apparently, it doesn't have a sound in my ear. That's it. There you go. That's it. Keep to the side of it. Go on.
Thank you. My question is, how can we use impermanence to gain insight or realizations into emptiness?
You have to start that question again and say it in a different way, please.
Really, I guess bottom line, what is the connection between emptiness or impermanence and emptiness?
Oh, okay, good. Thank you. Yeah. Well, basically, like I'm saying, everything that we hear that's called Buddhist philosophy, just leave it there for now. You might need it again. So everything, if you read Buddhism, you're reading about what Buddha thinks, isn't it? Do you understand? You're reading about karma. He says that's how reality is. Do you understand? He says impermanence is how things are. He says bodhicitta is what we're capable of. He says things are empty. All it is him presenting his view, his observation of how reality is. Can you hear that point? So one of the first teachings is how things don't have a permanent character. They're not in this gross level. They do change from moment to moment. They are the result of causes, and they change from moment to moment. That's impermanence. So that's easy. It's an easier one to grasp. We can hear it, isn't it? It's easier to hold. And that is, but the relationship between that and emptiness is simply, it's the first step. So if we can begin to realize impermanence, first of me realizing I'm gradually going towards death, then you get a wake-up call and you realize you want to change yourself because you know that things aren't set in stone. Then you learn to be more realistic because in reality things are changing all the time. So you start to not grasp so much at things, which means you become more content and more fulfilled. And that it's a stepping stone to then go further and realize that nothing has an intrinsic nature, which is much more subtle. So it's a stepping stone. In other words, you can't just leap towards emptiness. You could argue if you realize emptiness, it implied you realize impermanence because it's a grosser understanding, but it's a stepping stone. It can easily be misunderstood for emptiness, but it's a really good stepping stone. Do you understand? Okay. Who else? Any questions online or anything? Okay, not. All right. So then Lama says here in this first step, he gives us what they call the preliminary practices. And Lama says, I have to do that. So I suppose I should do it as well. So I'll mention it like in one sentence, at least stick to the tradition. Preparing for Mahamudra, part 1. Oh yeah, so this word of, that's right, this I was just talking about this great seal, the concept. So basically Buddha's saying, we're going to go to all this, that everything's not having an intrinsic nature. Everything that exists cannot have an intrinsic nature. Of course, initially we can't hear that, but we're going to go into it. Nothing that, if things were existing intrinsically, if things were existing inherently, if things were existing independently, if things were set in stone, which is how ego thinks, then something couldn't exist. Buddha says it's not viable, so nothing can exist like that. So that absence of that type of existence, which is emptiness, the absence of that fantasy is what seals everything as existing. It's like the character of everything that exists. And in fact, they say everything can exist only because they are empty of having an intrinsic, independent, inherent nature. So we're going to go into that. Mahamudra, the great seal. So these 4 preliminary practices I should mention, as Lama says, So the first one, if you heard this, if it's done in the proper way, you'd receive initiation. Even though this practice itself is not tantra, there is a tantric aspect to it, and Lama talks about it at the very end. But it's always been seen as a very high practice traditionally, although technically this is sutra. but it's always given in the framework of receiving a high spirit tantra initiation, which is clearly not what's happening here. So the first of the 4 preliminaries is what they call guru devotion. Traditionally, we present several preliminary practices before teaching Mahamudra. I cannot avoid these. Lama always spent very little time doing it. I have to explain them. So right at the beginning of the text, Panchen Lama pays homage to the Guru. Namo Mahamudraya, homage to Mahamudra, the all-pervasive nature of everything. I bow with respect at the feet of the incomparable Guru, the Lord of Siddhas, who teaches the naked state of reality, the indivisible and inexpressible sphere of the Vajra mind. So first, these are the preliminaries. Before you do your practice, you'd first sit down and you'd take refuge. And then you were the first one. Then second, you would generate bodhicitta, this aspiration to become a Buddha so you can be a benefit to others. You'd do these preliminary practices before you do the actual one of Mahamudra. And since these, this is quoting, since these are the gateways and the central pillar of the teachings, and especially the Mahayana, this should not be mere words. So the first one is refuge. You practice, you do your little refuge prayer. What refuge means is the very first step in becoming a Buddhist. You check the teachings, you listen to them, you like the look of it, you check it out, you think Buddha's a valid person, and then you formalize that in taking refuge, formalizing your commitment to be a Buddhist. It's done in a little ceremony, So first you'd start your practice with this, with the refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, as the Guru. And then the next one would you be then, because on the Mahayana path, there's a Mahayana teaching, you would then, as they call, generate bodhicitta. So bodhicitta is the culmination of these series of techniques in the Mahayana path, starting with equanimity that leads you to love, which is wanting others to be happy, which leads you to compassion, wanting others to not suffer, which leads you to great compassion, which is this sort of sense of responsibility of the I will make it happen, which eventually culminates in this outrageous paradigm shift really in the mind, where bodhicitta, where now only others are your concern. You've kind of done the job on yourself and you're finished. There's no longer the normal thought of I, which itself is a pretty shocking concept for us. This is bodhicitta. So you generate your bodhicitta, your aspiration to do this practice so you can be of benefit to others. And then the third one, you'd practice some purification. You'd do your Vajrasattva practice and do the 4 opponent powers and regret your negativity and have compassion for those you've harmed and do the mantra and resolve not to do it again. So they're the 4 preliminaries. That's done. So I did that now. Done. Oh, no, the 4th one. What's this one? Oh, yeah, the 4th one. Sorry. Guru Yoga, which is this, especially in Tantra or in the higher teachings, the role of your spiritual teacher. This is always said to be very important, and sometimes it's a puzzle because one of the commonest questions I think in our culture that we ask, well, do I need a teacher? And the word guru is just this Sanskrit word. I've heard it means heavy with qualities. It's a lovely word. Lama, I don't know, it's the equivalent in Tibetan. Lama Yeshe, because Ma is the female ending in Buddhism. It's curious, isn't it? Pa and Ma are the female and male endings. So it shows it's universal, doesn't it? It's hilarious. So, but Lama Yeshe would always say it means high mother. I'm sure it doesn't mean that. But he called it that. La means high. I don't know. Do you speak Tibetan, David? What? What about the word Lama? A literal translation of it. It's not a literal translation. No, it's not. In English, dear. Do you know? You don't. Basically he's saying he doesn't know. Thank you very much. I don't know either. But it's the equivalent of guru in Sanskrit. That's the point. The Tibetan word. So that's having a teacher, a spiritual teacher. And I think it's really obvious, if we think about it, that in our lives, everything we've ever learned, I think we've learned it from someone who knows how to do it. It's hardly rocket science. And it's the quickest method. I mean, how arrogant to think, I'm not going to ask anybody, I'm going to learn it myself. It's obvious, it's clear. I remember in Lama Yeshe, the way he put it, he said, well, you know what? Buddha's dead. And the only time the 4 Noble Truths will be real for you when you hear it, and these are my words, from the mouth of a person in front of you who is basically Buddha for you. Sort of obvious. That's the role of a teacher, It's really obvious. I mean, it's the same as in our, we know we just don't call these words, don't use these words, but in our culture, it's exactly the same. My mother was a musician. And where did she get her music from? She taught me Bach, right? Bach's music. Where'd she get it from? Her teacher. Where'd he get it from? Her teacher. And you know what? You track that back in an unbroken chain of real living human beings, knowledge holders. There's a lovely word in Tibetan, knowledge holder. My mother was a knowledge holder, and she got it from a previous knowledge holder. And you would track that back in an unbroken chain of human knowledge holders back to Bach, because Bach is dead. How else can I learn Bach except from a person who's living example of Bach? It's really obvious. That's the meaning of a guru. It's pretty clear, you know. Of course you need one of them. It's obvious. The power of the human connection. You can read 27 books on it and you could learn something, but as soon as you hear it from the mouth of a knowledge holder, it's real living knowledge, isn't it? It's pretty clear. So I've done the 4 preliminaries. That's it. 8 o'clock. Okay. So let's talk about these 2 modes of meditation that are taught. I think we have a lot of confusion in our culture about this word to meditate. And I think it's very telling when we hear the Tibetan term for it. I mean, I don't speak Tibetan, but it's the verb gom, and it literally translates as to become familiar with, to familiarize yourself with. It's a big surprise to us because we have this vague kind of idea. It's something to do with closing your eyes and, you know, having a mystical experience. And I really mean that because when we say spiritual, we think it's something beyond understanding. We think it's something that comes out of the blue. It's an experience. It's a one-off thing. And it's so kind of plain ignorant. So this traditional way of learning things, which is, as Lama says, the method he used in the monastery, studying for 25 years, first the theory, and then slowly you put it into practice, which is the typical way you learn, the first method that Panchen Lama says, but he uses the opposite one, which is the other way around. You go straight to the piano to intuit the music, to intuit emptiness. But let's look at the typical one, and the typical the 2 modes of meditation. So the first one, technically from that definition, is not meditation. It's a technique for getting the mind to be focused. So, of course, the focus, like I mentioned, that they're describing, it'll take you a couple of years in a very specific condition to do, to access, to get, is a way more subtle level than we can even imagine using our models of the mind and using neuroscience. This simply doesn't exist. That's why we think it's mystical. But it's the mind. You know, when we think something like this, we think there must be a soul or a spirit under there. That's when it's spiritual. But the Buddha only uses the mind. The word is the mind. So, you know, before we even get to meditation and this idea of going beyond the conceptual and beyond the sensory, we have to comprehend that as possible first. So let's look at what the Buddha says the mind is. We need to know that. Well, first of all, it's used synonymously with the word consciousness. Second, it's not physical. Third, it's not the handiwork of anybody else, which is a big shock. You either believe you came from God or you came from your mother and father. That's it. But no, Buddha says you come from yourself. Simple way of putting it, you know, your mind is a beginningless continuity of mental moments, is a river of mental moments, is a mental continuum. That's Buddha's assertion. Don't believe him, but he's got all his methodology, so we check it out and we use it as a hypothesis, you know. And this mind of ours also radically different insofar, as I said, that it has levels of subtle grossness and subtlety. Its job is to cognize, to be aware, to know. They are synonyms. That's the job of your mind. And of course, you ask the Buddha, well, cognize what, please? And he says, guess what, honey? That which exists. Reality. That's the goal. So, okay, this mind of ours then, it has the grosser level of cognition, which is sensory consciousness. Even that, Buddha's view of it is kind of shocking to us, you know, and it's a revelation. So we have eye consciousness, ear, The five, we know this. And we know, as Lama Yeshe puts it, we make the body the boss. From the second we wake up in the morning until the time we go to sleep, we are vividly conscious of this body. And as far as we are concerned, in the materialist model, we are only the body. That's what we are. This is me. So we have the physicality and the way the body feels is very vivid for us. And then we have the objects of the five senses, which is the rest of the world. So we live at this very gross level of sensory. And so when we say I consciousness, I look at that mug and I will say, well, that's a very pretty mug. Of course, we assume my I consciousness, my eyes are cognizing a pretty mug. Well, let's do the Buddha's analysis. First of all, your eyeball can't see anything. That's the function of your mind, and that's called in this case, it's a part of your mind that specifically functions through the medium of the eyeball and the nerves, and that's called eye consciousness. The capacity of your mind in dependence upon the eyeball to cognize something. So Lama talks about it in Mahamudra. We'll go into it. It's very nice. He talks about how the mind is like a mirror. And then what it does is it cognizes things. Things out in the world appear in the mirror. So here we're talking about a very specific part of your mind, which is a very gross level, called sensory consciousness, eye consciousness, ear consciousness. So this is the point already, which is a revelation. I will say, I see a really pretty cup. And of course, you assume it's my eyeballs. Well, that's ridiculous. First, your eyeballs can't. So then it's your eye consciousness. But your eye consciousness, all the sensory consciousnesses, as far as the Buddha is concerned, are profoundly limited in their capacity for cognition. So eye consciousness can only cognize two things, shape and color. Ear consciousness can only cognize sound. They're very, very profoundly limited in their capacity for cognition. So we give so much more power to them. We assume it's our eye consciousness that sees a pretty mug. No, not possible. So then what's going on? In other words, the question is, which part of my mind then is cognizing a pretty mug? Well, that's called your mental consciousness. This is hugely important to understand if you want to understand Buddhism, and to run your life better. Sensory consciousness, and then you've got your mental consciousness. And that, as Lama Yeshe says, as Lama Zopa says, that's where the workshop is. That's where the thousands of thoughts and feelings and emotions, unconscious, subconscious, instinct, intuition, this entire spectrum of our inner being, which for us is complete chaos. It's like a big soup of emotions in there, to which we pay no attention until they're shouting, And this is Buddha's expertise, the mind, with respect. Don't believe me? Check him out. So what's happening is this. My eye consciousness goes there, and I'm not joking, but quicker than Google, my mental consciousness, the workshop, is accessed, where all my billions of thoughts are all stored. What's fascinating in the Buddhist view, Buddha's telling us, as we know, that mind goes back and back into countless past lives. And he was saying everything we ever see, hear, taste, touch, smell, or think about, none of it goes astray. Everything is stored in my memory. And that's why we can get clairvoyance. When you remove the grosser obstacles and you start developing your mind, you literally can see more subtle things, including the past, including the future. This is completely normal in Buddhist psychology. Consciousness has that capacity, mental consciousness. Mental consciousness. Eye consciousness is thick as the post. You can only see shape and color. But look at the power we give our bodies. But it's mental consciousness. What it is, mental consciousness comes up with, based on my taste, what I've remembered, what I like, what I don't like, my anger, my this and my that, and I'll say, what a pretty cup. In other words, it is a viewpoint. It is a concept. It is a thought. It is an opinion. So we live in opinions. We live in viewpoints. And this is Buddha's expertise. This is where all the thoughts are. And this is what we have to unpack and unravel to get to recognize, from the Buddhist perspective, the rubbish, ridiculous, made-up rubbish in there, the thoughts, and the valid ones. That's what you're doing as a Buddhist. And with this part of our mind, the concepts, which is the grossest level of our mental consciousness, more subtle than sensory, but the grossest level we live at is the conceptuality. It's the tip of the iceberg of the capacity of our mental consciousness. And when you start to get samadhi, then you can access subtler levels of your mental consciousness, which are literally beyond conceptuality, beyond the gross level, and beyond the sensory. And that's what you can begin to access using this first mode of meditation. So there's mental consciousness, and then there's sensory. So when we start to see the distinction, we can change our lives. So you stub your toe, okay? And that's a sensory experience. That's sensory. And it's a painful feeling. You have feeling and you have pleasant or unpleasant. And you have them both at the sensory level and the mental level. Well, that's the evident one, the sensory. So that is what it is, an unpleasant feeling. But what happens is, within a millisecond, quicker than Google, mental consciousness arises. And because attachment, which is this greedy little vampire in here that only wants nice feelings, gets really upset, and it becomes aversion. And you get angry. And then you say, well, of course I'm angry. I stubbed my toe. Well, no, there's no logic there. It's a story we have made up. So it's an interpretation of that pain. So this is where it's a revelation. We can begin to understand. One is a sensory experience. You see noise, you hear noise. Next second you get upset. Well, of course I'm upset. There's a big noise. No, it's an opinion you've just made up because you have attachment. So your sensory is one thing, and the mental is another thing entirely. And mental consciousness is Buddha's expertise. So this is already revelation, giving us the space to realize we can reinterpret, our experiences, which is the job of the mind. So you learn that when you learn the Buddhist. The epistemological model of mind in Buddhism is incredibly sophisticated. It's totally amazing the way it works. And this is just one example. We have sensory and we have mental. And mental is our job. And then you've got the grosser level of mental, which is conceptuality, and that's the level we live at. In other words, this is very shocking too, all what we call emotions, feelings, they're all based on, underpinned by conceptual stories. But we've practiced them to perfection. We don't even notice that they're in our mind, And this is what we have to learn to do, to unpack and unravel all these conceptual stories and sort out the facts from the fictions. This is the job of being a Buddhist, I tell you. That's why you need some kind of concentration. This is a typical approach. So there's two modes of meditation, in both the regular approach and in the Mahamudra one. The first one is concentration, the development of which is labeled Samadi, single point of concentration. Or the technique is known to get it is called calm abiding, described in terms of 9 stages, and the result of which is called calm abiding. It's a certain level of samadhi. A level of mind, Lama talks about it in Mahamudra. I'll read you. It sounds like science fiction. Unbelievable. Let me do that to you now. Get you all excited. What you're capable of. Lama had this. See, Lama did that. They don't do that in the text. They don't tell you all the delicious things that come as a result of learning to get concentration. But Lama Yeshe did, because he was trying to get us to get excited. Try to get to see you have this amazing potential. Instead of thinking we're a bunch of creeps, This is how we think. So, the benefits of samadhi are incredible. Buddha says we've had samadhi in countless lifetimes. It's a low-level realization. And we lose it. We don't use it to realize emptiness. We use a plot. We lose the plot and fall down the mountain again. Page 39. Where is it? 39. Okay, I'll read you some of the things that you'll experience when you get samadhi, okay? It's inconceivable to us. Nothing remotely like it in our culture. It's mind-boggling. Okay. So first of all, Lama's telling us in this first mode of meditation, because you need to get to the subtle level, because only at that subtle level, I call it the microscope of your mind, is that level capable of realizing emptiness. We can't realize emptiness at a gross level, not a possibility. We can start, but we've got to access the subtle level. You cannot, as Lama says, to achieve the realization of Mahamudra, and the word Mahamudra basically is equivalent to the word emptiness. Think like that. Lama uses the word non-duality, non-self-existence. Mahamudra, they're all equivalents. They all refer to the word emptiness, which we're going to talk about. So as I mentioned, to achieve the realization of Mahamudra, the reality of non-duality, we first need to develop calm abiding. And in fact, it's not possible without it. We must achieve the subtler levels of consciousness of indestructible one-pointed concentration, what in Sanskrit we call Samadi. So it's difficult to realize non-duality, emptiness, not because it's hiding from us, but because our concepts are so thick. So we must refine our concepts. We must achieve subtle mindfulness, subtle awareness, subtle clarity. Otherwise, there's no way we can see the unconscious levels of ego, grasping, and independent self. Not possible. So Samadhi is the source of liberation. Without perfect Samadhi, there's no way to become liberated from samsara and no way to achieve enlightenment. There is no exception. Whether you're Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or Buddhist, to cut the dualistic view, we need calm abiding. But calm abiding is not enough. On the other hand, some people actually think that this state of samadhi, this one-pointed concentration, is all we need to cut the ego. And this is the point where Buddha diverged from the Hindus. I mean, these Hindus, they came up with all these views. They came up with how to get rid of samsara. They came up with the view of karma by observing. They came up with how to get renunciation. They came up with how to get extraordinary levels of realizations. But they didn't, from the Buddhist perspective, they didn't go all the way. They still were positing some intrinsic, permanent, inherent entity called as self, and indeed God. So Buddha diverged in his own direction from there, So they're pretty amazing geniuses already, and they're the ones who created this technique. As the Dalai Lama says, it was these amazing Indians more than 3,000 years ago who were the ones who began the investigation into the nature of self, not Freud, as we probably thought 100 years ago. We're so arrogant in our culture. So he says, that's not enough. And this can easily be mistaken because it's so astonishing, the levels of realization that you can have. You can easily mistake it for liberation. So astonishing. But this is wrong. You need more. Lama Tsongkhapa reminds us that calm abiding alone is not enough to cut the dualistic view. We also need to develop special insight or vipassana. So in Tibetan, we call it hlak tong. Hlak meaning extra, tong meaning seeing. So we can interpret this to mean that we go beyond seeing conventional reality and achieve this extra seeing of the universal reality of Mahamudra. In other words, we need the two kinds of meditation together, calm abiding and special insight. So in the very traditional approach, learning the theories, you listen throughout the day to the talks, your teacher, you go home, you sit down, you get some calm abiding, you stop the meditating, you stop the concentrating, you take that concentrated focused mind, you go to the second mode, and then you contemplate, you think through logically, analytically, the things you've learned until you get insight and the penny drops, and then you focus on that penny dropping. That's how you use the two modes of meditation in daily practice, So nevertheless, even without special insight, the results of samadhi alone are unbelievable, almost unimaginable. When we understand this, when we realize these amazing results are, we can't help but try to develop it. Let me explain some of the benefits. Lama always did this to try and get us excited. Because when he first met all the hippies, all he saw was all this self-pity. Self-pity, I'm bad, I'm hopeless, I'm no good. He was shocked by this kind of, and it's out our mouths, we vomit it out. I'm hopeless, I'm nothing, I'm nobody, blah, blah, blah. So Lama Yeshe calls ego self-pity me. Sounds kind of cruel, but we recognize that. They try to lift us up all the time. So one of the first things is the benefits of samadhi. You go beyond sensory and conceptual, which is all we posit in the modern world. So as your concentration develops, it's described in the text in terms of 9 stages of cultivation. You'll go beyond your body. Your mind will be non-conceptual. And then we have no equivalent of that, really. Well, sensory, yes, but, the only way we live at the level of mental consciousness is at the level of conceptuality. So even all our emotions, which we feel in our body, that is the tip of the iceberg. They're all coming from the deep down concepts that we practiced in the depth of our mind, which is why we need concentration to get to them. So your mind becomes non-conceptual. So it becomes easy to cut the complex world of the 5 sense objects, to eliminate all the superstitions. Superstitions are really, they use that word literally. That is a great word. If you're superstitious, you believe in something that doesn't exist, don't you? Well, that's exactly what Buddha says. Attachment is a superstition. It believes the cake will make you happy. It believes the boyfriend's the cause of all your happiness. Ego grasping believes it's an intrinsic I, isn't it? It's just a superstition. It's exactly a brilliant word. In such a unified state of this non-conceptuality, you know, your mind becomes so subtle, so sharp, you can easily eradicate the complex dualistic thoughts. You can touch reality. And then out of meditation, you can easily deal with your delusions. They are so light. You can stop them immediately. Can you imagine? You know, we say we're anxious and we're literally having a panic attack, isn't it? It's physical. When you say angry, it's physical. You're shouting, your body's shaking. But that's the only time we notice them. The stories have been building up a long time. We don't notice until it's vomiting out the mouth. So when you've got this samadhi begun even in your meditation, when you come out of your meditation, what's so shocking, but it's literal, you have complete and effortless control over every single thought. There's no remote equivalent of that. It seems insane to think that you can get that. But these Indians invented this 3,000 years ago, this ability. So now the next one is you experience bliss. Well, this is hilarious to us, you know. And what we have to understand too with the Buddhist view of the mind, this is very surprising to us. We all know we don't want suffering feelings and we want happy feelings. The word feeling in Buddhism, we'll go into it in more detail, it's a very interesting word in Buddhism. It's referring to these it's one of what I call the mechanics of the mind. You've got negative, neurotic, deluded, the 21 synonyms, conceptual puzzles, all those dramas, misconceptions, delusions, afflictions, anger, attachment, jealousy, pride, blah. We all know them, they're neurotic ones. Then you've got the virtues, love and compassion and kindness. They're our saving grace. We've got all of these mixed like a big soup. And as far as our culture is concerned, they've got equal status. That's a normal person. What Buddha's whole point is, this first lot are not at the core of our being and can be removed. And the second lot are who we really are and can be developed to perfection. It's pretty shocking for us. That's his view. The third lot of states of mind, there's 3 categories, they call them negative, positive, and neutral, which sounds rather weird to us. But these neutral ones, I'd rather call them the mechanics of the mind. They're the things we all need to function, like intention, concentration, good memory, discrimination. Whether you're a sniper or a meditator, you need good concentration. You need good discrimination. Discrimination is working every second that enables us to distinguish between pink and blue and round and white and red and flower, everything, every second. So if you're a sniper, you need very good discrimination. Otherwise, you'll kill the wrong person. Everybody needs good concentration. And these are neither negative nor positive. That's why it's so important in Buddhist psychology to understand the meaning of that. Don't just hear it as some moralistic thing. But these are neither of those, but they're crucial states of mind. So in that category, it's so surprising, there's one called feeling. Not the way we call it, like emotion. And there's only 3 kinds. Pleasant feeling, which is another word for happy feeling. Unpleasant feeling, which is another word for suffering feeling. And the third one called neither. So forget the neither, forget the neutral here. We only care about the negative, the unhappy and the happy, the pleasant and the unpleasant. And of course, there's a whole spectrum of those. You can have the mildest stub of the toe, which is unpleasant feeling, to the most intense agony when you lose your leg or when you get tortured. That's definitely called suffering. And it can either have sensory experiences of it, sensory unpleasant feelings, or mental. And these are not delusions, they're unpleasant feelings. And it's very hard to unpack all these because we just have a big lump of emotion. We can't see the difference. So feeling, Buddha's basically saying, we all want happy feelings, happiness, and we don't want suffering feelings. And this is almost the basis of his 4 Noble Truths of how to get rid of suffering feelings and how to get happy ones. So these feelings are the mind. They're the mind. So bliss is simply a very nice word for very, very, very pleasant feelings. Lama uses the word ecstasy as well. I've never had ecstasy. It's a very pleasant feeling, isn't it? And so this is the point now. The Buddha's telling us the degree to which our mind is caught up in anger and jealousy and all the neuroses is the degree to which we have very, very, very unpleasant feelings mentally. So the degree to which we lessen the neuroses and therefore grow the virtues is the extent to which we have pleasant feelings. So happiness comes from the practice of virtue, and unhappiness comes from the practice of the delusions. It's his fundamental point. So bliss is a natural quality of our mind. Whoever would have thought that? You think it's come from the boyfriend, you know? You experience bliss. In other words, another way of getting it, well, he's telling us here, I'll read him. In this subtle state of concentration, you experience bliss. And Lama uses, he learned these words. Don't ask me where he got them from. Ecstatic bliss, just naturally. The more concentration you have, meaning the more subtle your mind is, the less conceptual and sensory, the more subtle, that's what it means, the more integrated you are, and thus the more rapture, the more bliss you experience. In the beginning, the bliss you experience is physical, which is the grosser level. But as your concentration deepens, as you throw off the layers of blankets of grosser consciousness, you experience bliss exclusively at the mental level. This is because you have stopped perceiving all the objects of the five senses. You've closed the door to superstition. All the contradictory concepts have disappeared. Your mind is now crystal clear. I mean, who would have thought? And as soon as we hear this, we think, oh, that's religion. But this is Buddhist psychology. Very fascinating. I mean, who doesn't want that? I mean, who doesn't want that, you know? So the thing is, I remember you talk to anybody who's had a little bit of meditation experience, people who have, they all talk about, I remember one friend of mine is a regular person and had a very pleasing meditation one day, experienced a lot of pleasure. And she said that the interesting thing about it was that it was incredibly peaceful. But you listen, you check pleasure that we get through our senses. It's incredibly disturbed, isn't it? Even if you're really thirsty and you drink just water, the pleasure that you experience in your mind is very because it's based on attachment. So it's very, very distressing, very disturbing. And I mean, not trying to be too gross here, when you think of the most intense pleasure people have, which is usually based upon contact with a human body, I mean, people go berserk. It's like berserk pleasure. You understand? Because it's not calm. It's not calm. It's the opposite. But this mental pleasure is incredibly calm. It's very fascinating. And that's, joy, pleasure, happiness. This is the whole point. Well, it sounds so silly, but this is the point of what Buddha is telling us we can accomplish, besides compassion. The job of getting rid of delusions is to bring you liberation from suffering, which means be blissful and clear and wise and happy. Happy. Buddha's telling us how to get happy. Our problem with happiness, because it comes from attachment and it comes from objects out there, we are so addicted to believing that not only is the cake the cause of my happiness, but we believe even the cake is the happiness itself. So when we talk about our pleasure, tell me about your happiness, Robina. I'll describe the cake. Tell me about your pleasure, Robina. I'll describe the boyfriend. When you have memories, you think of the events. We never think of the mental, because that cake is merely, for Buddha, is merely a trigger for happy feelings. But the happiness is in here, and the suffering's in here. It's very fascinating. It's time to go home. It's enough then. A bit more. One more thing how you'll feel when you get samadhi. You'll always be joyful. I mean, just in daily life, you'll always be happy by. This is ridiculous. When you arrive to meditation, you feel liberated instead of uncertain and full of doubts and conflicts. You experience inner peace. You'll always be happy, joyful, vibration. In fact, you continuously experience tremendous pleasure. Now the pleasure of chocolate is nothing. What you experience now is your mind is super. It's like another realm, another dimension. Don't think of this as spiritual, please. This is Buddhist psychology. You get it from hard work. It's your mind's potential. And when your senses do come into contact with their objects, of course, you experience bliss then too. You're already blissful. It's like a bonus, you know. So right now with attachment, we're feeling utterly bereft and not anything, because that's the function of attachment, is to feel dissatisfied. I am nothing. I have nothing. So of course we grasp like vampires at the cake. We get pleasure for 1 second and then it disappears. Then we've got to get the cake again. But here, this is your natural state. So you have it already. I mean, I think it's just so delicious. And the other one is you develop clairvoyance. So Lama Tsongkhapa says that when you develop clairvoyance, according to the Abhidharma teachings, there are 2 levels. So one is what we understand as intuition, an untrained sense that we all have to some extent. For example, you might feel strongly without any logical proof that something has happened to your dear friend back home. And I think that's something we can comprehend. I think it's a bit like this, I think. You know, when we're really caught up in our gross states of mind, like our very strong sensory experiences and very strong attachment, very strong anger, you're really gross. And you can see, you can't see past your own nose. You're totally self-absorbed, you know, isn't it? But when you've got a little bit more virtue, a bit more space, there's more space, therefore more, the quality of the virtues, love and compassion, is they're necessarily connected to others. You're more empathetic. So it's like your mind's not quite so gross. So therefore you can be sensitive to people's feelings. That's all this is. So as you have that even a bit more, a friend of mine, for example, says, he's not trying to show off or anything, he was talking about it. And people have these kinds of experiences. When you're more sensitive from more virtue, he said there was something that happened. He had his something, a friend, something fell on the friend and hurt her. And he said just before it happened, he had this vivid feeling. He could see even she slightly changed, this kind of a darkness came, and he felt strongly it was going to happen. He thought, oh, that's silly. And it happened. People think this all the time. That's because you're more aware of the outside. And that's because of virtue. You understand what I'm saying? You literally become, and that's the beginnings of clairvoyance. And we can develop to this incredibly sophisticated degree. That's the point the Buddha's saying. It's not just some accident that happens. You can develop it, you know? So because you're accessing a subtle level of mind, which is capable of seeing the past and the future. That's the point. It's literally capable of seeing the past and the future. Not some hippy-trippy thing, you know. So the other one can be gained by training the mind in meditation, just like we're talking here, as Lama says. You're able to see long distances as well as other people, including their minds. At first, your experiences seem a bit like a dream, but the more your concentration develops, the more clearly you can see, just as you would if you were there in person. And this is the thing Buddha says, you really can't begin to benefit sentient beings until you have clairvoyance, which is why, you know, back thousands of years ago, no doubt there were highly evolved beings. You just get concentration naturally, and then you go off and start getting bodhicitta. And now you're capable of benefiting others because you can see what the hell's going on. You can see their past karma and what's happening. And all these holy beings, these lamas that we know, that's their great quality. So then they're really able to advise you because they can see 47 lives ago and 50 lives in future and know exactly how to advise you. We're walking around blind, you know. Meaning well is not enough. You need wisdom. And the first wisdom is to get is the wisdom of clairvoyance. So it's very powerful, you know. This kind of clairvoyance is not imagining something. It's real in the present. That'll do. Time to go home. I mean, I think Lama was just so kind because poor Western hippies were so pathetic and so self-pity is how we all are. So miserable. I'm hopeless. I'm nothing. I'm nobody. Life has no meaning. It's not worthwhile, you know. All this is trying to lift us up and show there's more to it than you think, baby. And it's your potential. That's the thing for me when I first heard the Lama's teaching. That somehow there was a possibility, you know, there's potential there. And I think if we can hook in, no matter how bad things are, if we know they're not set in stone, we know they're not permanent, and we know we've got this marvelous potential and the techniques are all there, that's encouraging. That's encouraging. Not just cross your fingers and hope for the best. Okay. Keep your questions for tomorrow. All right. So the homework tonight, you go home, and then when you hit the pillow, you make a decision. May I see my dreams as dreams? There's a lovely analogy for realizing things are more spacious is when things are like a dream. Because when you have a dream, then you wake up and go, oh, it was only a dream. It was a lovely dream. I always remember as a little girl, we were very poor, and we'd love to go to the beach. And in the dream, I'd have this beautiful bucket and spade for the sand, because we always had share of it because we were so poor. We never had our own possessions as little children. There were 7 of us. My poor mum and dad couldn't keep up with it, So I always had this bucket and spade. It was so heavenly. I'd wake up and I'd be so sad. It was only a dream, When the bad things happen, it's the same. Oh, it's only a dream. So this one of seeing your dreams as dreams doesn't mean waking up and remembering. It means as you're dreaming, realize it's a dream. That's a good piece of homework. Then the next piece of homework is when you wake up, and I'm going to laugh. You've got to laugh now. If you wake up, we all think we will because we believe we're permanent. If you wake up in the morning, go, wow, I can't believe I'm still alive. I'm going to hop out of bed, do my thing, do my practice, come to here and learn more about how to develop my marvelous potential. All right? That's your homework. Okay? Put the prayers up, please, Mary. Little dedication prayer. Due to the merits, due to the virtuous karmic imprints we put into our mind from listening to these teachings, may we quickly become a guru Buddha, just like our guru, the Buddha, and lead all sentient beings without exception into that enlightened state. Next one. So may the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow in the minds of beings, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And this little prayer for souls to live long. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Lama Zopa wrote that prayer. And now a nice prayer that His Holiness wrote for the swift return of Lama Zopa. So peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Lozang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable, venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. Such a great loss. I think such is a better word. I say such a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truths of the blessings of the ocean of the 3 jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Okay. Thank you, darling people. See some of you tomorrow. We can continue this delicious teachings of Lama Yeshe. Thank you.